Everybody's still on 4th of July jet lag. Whether you stayed up late and had to get up early the next morning, go to work, or stayed up late for 4 days in a row. I saw a cute little thing that said, hey, for those of you that are getting up, could you kind of keep it quiet? There was a lot of us that stayed up late shooting off fireworks last night. All right, we are continuing our study on Solomon. Nope, here, you want this one, sorry. Thank you. And today we're in part 6. We're looking at some of the works that Solomon did that we still have in front of us, in particular the Book of Proverbs. Aaron.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. All right, the Book of Proverbs is, we're going to talk about it today, and we know that that's part of it is some of Solomon's writings. It's a book of wise sayings. It's not just a collection of phrases, but rather it's what they refer to as an Oriental textbook, and it is used to school young people in wise and right living by the repetition of wise thoughts. Okay? For those teachers that are here with us today, you know that it's repetition that somebody remembers things, okay, by repetition. And so you continue to teach that way. When I was in the restaurant business, I worked for Shoney's years ago. One of the phrases that we had when we would get ready to open up a new restaurant is we need to understand that it's going to take 27 times of us telling somebody something before they remember it. Okay, 27 times you'd tell every waitress, when the fanny hits the fabric, the water hits the table. That was their big thing. The minute you sat down, boom, your water should be at your table with your waitress. When the fanny hits fabric, water hits the table. You did it 27 times. You did that on everything in the restaurant. And it's no different here, really, with the way the Israelites learned, the way their young people learned. It is wisdom that it's put into these short, sharp phrases. Sometimes they're dramatic contrasts, and sometimes they're unforgettable scenes from life. And it clearly sets out what is right and what is wrong. Now, it's not just a slick formula for success, because the wisdom in Proverbs is based on reverence for God and obedience to His laws. Okay? That's the part that we need to remember. The fear of the Lord is the basis of all true human wisdom. This is the starting point. But Proverbs applies the principles of God's teaching to the whole life, to relationships, home, work, justice, decisions, attitudes, reactions, everything we say and do and even think. God has taught us what is best, and experience proves it. And so that's what we're going to look at today a little bit. The book is divided in 8 main sections, okay? It basically runs like this. There's a general introduction on wisdom, and that's in chapters 1 through 9, okay? Then there's 6 collections of sayings in Proverbs 10 through 31. And then it finishes out with an alphabet acrostic on the good wife. And an acrostic, for those of you that want to know, is something that starts with the letter that has a very specific meaning. In this case, the chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, every phrase starts with a letter of the alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay? There you go. Jim gave me a grace. God's riches at Christ's expense. Any of those phrases that you can do, that's an acrostic. And so for the Hebrews, this was one that was easy for them to remember because it was done with their alphabet, okay, in the order of their alphabet. Now, it's generally accepted that the material that's contained in Proverbs belongs to the days of Israel's first kings, okay? Although editing continued for several centuries afterwards. In fact, we know King Hezekiah organized some of the editorial work in Proverbs chapter 25, verse 1. It specifically says that. He lived 250 years after Solomon. And so the book, as we see it today, was finalized somewhere around 180 BC by a guy by the name of Joshua ben Sirah. He also helped compose and organize the book of Ecclesiastes, or in other words, put all of these different things together. Now, Solomon's exact contribution is unknown, though his name appears in the title, and he is the author or the compiler of 2 of the longest collections of Proverbs. And that's chapter 10 through chapter 22, verse 16, and then also chapters 25 through 29. Those we know specifically were by Solomon. Okay? We've discussed how Solomon was known as a man who had outstanding wisdom. His courts were full of people who came to hear him speak and to seek answers and for the exchange of learning. 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 32 through 34 makes it fairly clear for us what his knowledge and accomplishments were. And I want to read that to us so that we, as soon as my Bible loads up here. 1 Kings 4, not 3. Boy, hit one little wrong button, you're in trouble out in Bible land here. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all of the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. Now, that kind of tells us what Solomon's knowledge and his accomplishments were. Through his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, Solomon had really close links to Egypt, right? And perhaps he'd been exposed to a book called The Wisdom of Amenope, which is closely paralleled in Proverbs chapter 22:17 through 23:14. Now, I stopped and did a little bit of research on this because I'm like, okay, well, what is this book? What is this all about? The instructions of Amenemope, whatever, was composed between 1300 BC and 1075 BC, and it's a collection of sayings and admonitions that set forth practical instructions for living. Okay, so first of all, that's about the time frame of just before Solomon and before the kings in Israel. You can find these works in a book by Vincent Pierre Michel Launay. And it's called that, The Wisdom of Amenemope. Okay, they don't tell you how to pronounce it, so I'm guessing I'm probably butchering it. But there are many arguments both ways as to who copied from whom, and there's also a debate as to whether it is taken from a much earlier source in Egypt. But either way, it doesn't change the fact of what it is and what it means. And we also need to understand the impact that Proverbs has on our lives. Also remember this. Okay, let's say Solomon did get some of it from this wisdom of Amenemope, of this Egyptian guy. Okay, we also must remember that Solomon and his wise men culled through the wisdom of the East, but they only incorporated that which was in line with God's standards. Okay, so that gives us a pretty good confidence in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is often best studied by way of themes rather than by just straight reading through the book. And there's several books in the Bible that we all know that are like that. It's much easier to read it by themes or study it by themes than try and just read it straight through. Okay? By looking at themes, we can weigh one saying against the other and get a general idea of the general teaching on a particular topic. It's important to bear in mind that Proverbs are by nature generalizations. They state what is generally true and not what is invariably true. Okay? The writers do not deny that there are exceptions, but exceptions are not within the scope of proverbial sayings. In other words, I'll give you some examples in a minute here. Well, for example, Proverbs states that those who live by God's standards will prosper in the world. Okay? This is in generality a truth. But it's not an unqualified truth. It's not an exact truth. We see this in Job's life, right? Job he followed God. He didn't have a very good time in his life. Also, Jesus' life. And that shows the other side of the coin, okay? So, there are exceptions. Now, when reading the book of Proverbs, you're going to encounter wisdom in two ways. First, through the many proverbs and instructions of the book, we learn that it is a quality that we should strive to acquire. The experience of many generations has been passed down in the ages of Proverbs and distilled into these, the writer here calls them pithy sayings that represent truth about human nature and relationships. Okay? And then secondly, we're going to see wisdom through the book of Proverbs. It's going to be personified as a woman. We're going to find her in the streets calling out to the youth to follow her paths of goodness and righteousness. But then we also see her described as an essential part of God's creative and ordering role from the beginning of time. She was created by God and yet alongside him at creation, participating in the event. Okay? So wisdom is not just something that we learn. It is an offer to us by God through the figure of wisdom, the figure of this personified woman, who's the embodiment of right and truth and good living and part of the essential order of the created universe. In other words, God created it this way. Okay? Now, the youth is offered two paths. The one is to folly and destruction, and it's represented by the prostitute or loose women who entice and seduce the young, unsuspecting men into her perfumed bed. It's an image that contains a picture of pagan fertility rites. The other is a woman who shows them what wisdom and life is all about, and it's represented by the figure of wisdom who stands for truth and knowledge and understanding. In other words, to know this wisdom is to know something of the nature of the Godhead. To know folly is to only run after false deities. Okay? Now, I want to talk a little bit about the book and what the book in general has informational-wise for us. And I've got a handout I want to pass out to everybody today, and it's a really great breakdown of the book of Proverbs. Kind of gives you a list of, hey, if I had to go look something up, if I had to get a rough idea of what's going on here or what, this would be the place that you would go to go look at that.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Proverbs, as you can see, it's kind of broke down, not necessarily by chapter and verse, but it's really broke down by what's going on in the book. And so really we see the opening section, chapters 1 through 9, is called True Wisdom. Okay? And he starts first by talking to the reader in verses 1 through 6. It opens with the statements of its purpose. Verses 2 through 6, he makes it very clear what he's trying to do here. And then its basis in verse 7. And it's aimed at the young and the uninstructed. But remember, no one is too old or too wise to learn. Proverbs and the sayings that are encapsulated in Proverbs, they kind of bring wisdom all together. Not cleverness, but wisdom is the path to life. From there he moves on and he says, let me give you some advice to the young. Verses 7 through 19. The teacher addresses his pupils as a wise father would address his son. The young man had a vital choice to make between the right course and the wrong course, between wisdom and folly, between going God's way through life and going his own. And the teacher describes the two alternatives and shows where each of these alternatives leads. He moves on in verses 20 through 33 where he says, wisdom calls out. Everywhere wisdom is crying out loud in verses 20 and 21. And she calls to everyone. There is no greater folly than choosing not to fear the Lord. And we're going to hear that phrase quite often, fear the Lord. Chapter 2, he goes on to say, if you listen. That's what everything in chapter 2 is about, if you listen. Wisdom is to be found through knowing God. It is hard won, but worth every effort. Verses 1 through 10. It's a safeguard against wrongdoing and bad company, both male and female. And you see the verses quoted there. It sets our feet on the right path. So if you've listened, then the teacher says, well, let me give you some advice. The teacher's advice. Take wise teachings to your heart. Stay humble and trust God. Wisdom offers the things that money can't buy. Peace, happiness, security. Think about this. This is a kind of a crazy one as I went through this. He says, wisdom was at work in the creation, and it continues to be worked out in the do's and don'ts of everyday life and relationships. I never think about, when we talk about wisdom, talk about creation, I never think about God using wisdom to go, well, probably would be wise to bury some of this stuff under the ground and not leave it all out here where they can just walk around and pick it up, right? Okay? We don't often think about that wisdom. The teacher passes on his own father's instructions. That's chapter 4, verse 1. Now, I think that's really interesting. That's something that I think each generation is slowly losing now. I think back to we have a guy up in an Amish family up in Bowling Green that we've done a fair amount of business with. And I get to go up and see David, and I watch. The first guy I ever met was David's father. And then he introduced me to David, who's taking over the business. They do have a cabinet shop. They make cabinets. And now David is teaching his sons. His sons haven't moved away. They haven't gone to different states. I know that's, a lot of us have that, where, our kids are in different places. But in that particular community, they stay there. And the father passes that information down to the sons. And that'll eventually be, that's what they're going to be. Okay? And we've lost a lot of that now, the passing down portion. And it's through, ladies, it's a little different. It's when you're sitting around a quilt or when you're working on some knick-knack or whatever. That's where you guys are sharing your wisdom. For the guys, it's in the shop. It's where we work. It's turning a wrench on a car, or it's, planing a piece of wood or whatever that might be, okay? Where we share, not only do we share our history, but we also share some of these types of wisdom type things, okay? I know I can look back now and see over the past 15 or 16 years that Joe has worked with me, my son, I can see the growth there and go, oh, I don't have to tell him, hey, keep your hands out of the way anymore. You don't want to get a finger cut off. Right? I mean, you said that enough and it got in their head, their hand stays away. You don't worry about that. Or the wisdom of, hey, we need to do this step first before we do this step. Okay?
Did you have to tell him 27 times?
I'm pretty sure. If he'd have cut his finger, he'd only ever had to learn once. There are some things that are actual practice teaches you faster than this. But passing down a father's instructions. And I think sometimes it's not just about passing down the instructions about, hey, here's what I do or here's how I do it, but sometimes it's the little things. How do you treat a lady? How do you treat your kids? How do you treat your fellow workers? How do you treat the senior citizen? How do you treat, yesterday we went to Walmart in the afternoon, and we were walking out of Walmart, and there was a young couple coming out, and they were just across the driveway from us, and he sneezed. And I heard Kim say, God bless you, and I had my back turned, so I didn't hear him say anything. And as they were walking away, I thought, well, man, he didn't answer you. And she goes, oh, yeah, he did. He said, thank you. And I said, okay, somebody's taught him properly. Because there's a lot of little things like that we don't think about. How many, hold the door open for somebody? Lady or guy. I mean, it's just those little things that we teach. And oftentimes we're teaching by example, but we're also teaching in those times of life where we're spending time with somebody. Yeah.
I have at work, at my counter, I have a thing that has some suckers in it.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's kids that come up, like boys and girls and stuff, and I'll say ladies first, and I give the ladies
Mm-hmm.
first choice, so that the boys are growing up, ladies first.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. That's an example that has to be started to taught at a young age. Otherwise, it's a free-for-all. That's a great example. Okay, he moves on in chapter 5, and he says, be faithful. He talks about being wise when it comes to women. Don't fall for a cheap line, especially from a married woman. Now, we could turn that phrase around just as easy. Be wise. Don't fall for a cheap line from a married man. Okay? But turn that around just as easy. It is very, very hard for guys to be wise when it comes to women. We try. All right. Chapter 6 and 7, he says, beware. Beware of accepting unlimited liability for anybody. Beware of idleness. Beware of the fate of a bad lot. He talks a lot about earning your keep. Do what you're supposed to. Okay? Then he moves on and he talks about the temptress. He describes a young man falling for a married woman's shameless seduction. Judging by the number of warning in Proverbs, this was apparently fairly common in their culture. Okay? He moves on in chapter 8 to talk about in praise of wisdom. Wisdom makes an open appeal to all as they go about their daily business. The value of wisdom's instructions is beyond any earthly fortune. And I think that's kind of interesting, at least in my head. It's interesting to me to think about that. That wisdom is all around you every day, all day long. Do you look for it? Yeah, thank you, Cindy. Do you look for it, and do you see it, and do you recognize it, and do you use that wisdom? You know, we oftentimes, I think sometimes we call that divine appointments, but I think that's also an opportunity for wisdom to either work through us or to work into us. Okay, you know, I've had those divine appointments where it wasn't about. Let me think of one. I just read one yesterday from a guy. He had gone. I don't remember. He was somewhere up in Iowa, and he was waiting for this train to come through. He was a photographer. And he said, I always go to this place, and I'd called ahead of time and asked this guy, can I use the roof of your building to get this picture of this train? And the guy said, oh, yeah, you know, and he told him the date. And the guy said, well, if I'm not around, get a hold of so-and-so, and they'll let you in. Okay. He got there, couldn't get a hold of anybody. He's like, well, I guess I'm not supposed to be on the roof today. So he went to a bridge where he could be right over the tracks and see. And he's waiting. He doesn't know what time the train's coming through. He has an idea where it's stopped and what's happening. He's waiting, and he said, it wasn't very long. He said, now I'm in the hood. I'm in a bad part of town. It wasn't very long until I saw a homeless guy coming. The homeless guy walked past me, and then he turned around and he came back, and he said, hey, mister, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. Why? Well, I just want to make sure you weren't thinking about jumping off the bridge. I got my camera here. I wasn't thinking about jumping off the bridge. But he said, what are you waiting for? They sat there and they had a conversation for like 30 minutes, and he found out that this guy is extremely intelligent. He's a heroin addict. He spends $10 a day on his heroin, his addiction. And finally he said, you know, it's getting late. Let's see, I think it started raining or something. They went under the bridge, talked for a while. Anyway, he said, it's getting late. Are you hungry? And the guy said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I am. I could use a good cheeseburger. He says, well, I got $10 for you here, or $20, whatever it was. And the guy said, no, I'm not going to go buy drugs with this. I want you to know. Gets in his little thing. I got my $10 for each day set aside for my drug habit. I really will go eat lunch with this. And off he went. That was that guy's, he said, I wanted to be in a different spot to get a picture, but this was my appointment for the day, was to meet this guy and to just share with him, you know. So I thought that was very interesting. So we talk about this wisdom being all around us, and that's the sharing of that. He moves on in chapter 9 to talk about wisdom and folly. All the teacher's previous lessons kind of come together in this vivid picture of wisdom that he uses, then also his picture of folly. Okay? And this kind of brings us through that first whole section of true wisdom. And then from here, chapter 10 through 22 is Solomon's Proverbs. And really it starts about, and all of Solomon's Proverbs talk about this, that a young man has been faced with the choice, and he's urged to choose wisdom. And now the instructions begin, practical instructions that range over every aspect of life. He basically says, look, you're gonna have to make these choices at some point in time in your life. I'm telling you, I've been there and I've done this, and these are the things that I know from this. Okay? He moves on to talk about 30 wise sayings that he shares through there. Now, it is widely accepted that this chunk of Proverbs contains creative use of material from all around, not necessarily from Solomon, okay? In addition to material from Israel's own wise men, here was incorporated the teaching of that Egyptian guy that I can't pronounce his name of, in 30 sections as well. The sayings in this section are much more connected than in previous sections. In other words, they're grouped together much better. They're not just these random things that are all over the place. They begin with, in verses 22 through 29, things to avoid, things to stay away from. In verses 1 through 8, he talks about the hazards of social climbing. If that's your focus in life, is getting up the ladder of success, you better beware of these hazards. Verses 12 to 28, he talks about father and son, discipline and advice, how that should work. Then he stops and he gives this portrait of a drunkard in verses 29 through 35. You know, if you don't pay attention, this is what's going to happen. He begins his teaching, or there's teaching on wisdom and folly in verses 1 through 14. There's teaching on right living. In other words, what's good, what will help you, verses 15 to 22. Then he talks about justice and hard work in 23 through 34. And then he ends that whole section by saying, let me tell you about these lazy people. Okay? Now, the next 4 chapters are more of Solomon's sayings. I don't know why they're broken up like this. I don't know what, between the time Solomon put them together and Hezekiah reorganized them, and then we went another 400 or 500 years, and this Joshua ben Selah worked on them. I don't know how they got organized, but they're kind of broke apart. But this is a collection that King Hezekiah gathered together and edited specifically. And we see that it's grouped together and it relies more on comparison than contrast for effect. Okay? And the Proverbs draw their pictures from nature and from everyday life. Things that we can relate to. Things that are going on around us. Finally, in chapter 30, there's the sayings of Agur. Both Agur and Lemuel, who's in chapter 31, are non-Israelites. Now, we need to remember, Massa, which is who they were part of the Massa tribe, that was an Arab tribe that was descended from Abraham's son Ishmael. The East, which is where they all went, were famous for their wisdom, right down to Christ's birth. Think about that, Matthew 2, chapter 1. It was Magi from the East that came, right? So Agur is a man whose close observation of life and nature have taught him humility and taught him how to be humble. And then finally in chapter 31, verses 10 through 31, he talks about, verse 31, 1 through 9, King Lemuel talks about his mother's teachings, what his mom taught him. Okay? And then he closes this entire book with a section called The Good Wife. Proverb paints a remarkable picture of the power of a woman, for good and for ill. It closes with an acrostic poem, which is, each of the 22 verses start with a new letter from the Hebrew alphabet about the best of wives. Now, what you need to remember when you read this is written and looked at from the perspective of a man. And it reflects a time when the woman's identity was defined largely by her place and her role in the family. Okay? So in our modern culture, they would look at that and go, well, most of these don't make any sense. Well, it's because you're not looking at it the same way that it was looked at the time. Also, unless you're a guy, it's hard sometimes to look at it in the different light. Okay?
Well, back in that day, didn't they pretty much look at women as property?
Yes, they looked at them as property, but also Solomon and the writer of Proverbs were wise enough to understand the importance of the woman and the woman in the family and the growth and the teaching, the education of that. And those that learned that, hopefully, didn't necessarily look at them totally as property. All right, that kind of wraps up a brief picture of the book of Proverbs. Now, I want to close with this thought. The expression, the fear of the Lord, is the pivot point of all the wisdom literature in the Bible. That includes Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Psalms. Okay? Those 4 books. The fear of the Lord is the pivot point of all the wisdom literature in the Bible. In other words, if you took a pyramid and you turned it upside down, right there, the fear of the Lord is that point that everything rests on. Okay? Now, listen carefully to this. Secular philosophy tends to measure everything by human beings and comes to doubt whether wisdom is to be found at all. By the Old Testament, with this motto, the fear of the Lord, it turns the world upside down and puts God at its head, his wisdom and creative and ordering principle that runs through every part. And the result, his people who are disciplined and taught by that wisdom will find life and fulfillment in his perfect will. That's a lot of words, but when I read that, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. When you think about not all, but some of the philosophy tends to focus more on our aspect rather than on God's aspect. Okay? Now, stop there. Thoughts, comments?
I
Okay.
is really helpful. Like, you know, it may be like anger, and this is what Proverbs says.
All the different passages relating to anger.
Words that you speak, and all about our words. I think that's a real helpful way to look at the Book of Proverbs.
Okay. That'd be a great tool. You have to give me the name of that book. That'd be interesting to see. Any other thoughts or comments? Ooh. Sorry, Jeremy. Well, we can see the long-term effect that Solomon has had on the nation of Israel. It wasn't just the temple or the time of peace that Solomon ruled. This was a long term. This was in helping raise the children. This was in the next generation and what the next generation stood for and understood and who they were. He affected them as well. Next week, we're going to take a look at Ecclesiastes and see what Solomon had to do in regards to that and what that was all about. Okay?
I've never read the Book of Proverbs, but I think that with this, I'm going to do that.
That would be great. That'd be a good challenge, is to read through it. And especially if you have the outline, which will help you understand the sections that you're going into. Because if you just read it through like you would a novel, or like you would the account of Genesis, you're like, whoa, 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 what's this? We're all over the place. There's no real like story to follow. There's not. So.
That kind of makes you wonder too, like what a compilation of wisdom look like today?
Encyclopedia Britannica. Actually, most people would go Google, right? Google. Well, yeah, I mean, it goes without saying.
Beware of crowdsourced wisdom. That would be my way.
And I don't know it off the top of my head, but I'll bet if we looked, we could find something in the Book of Proverbs about crowdsourced wisdom. Running with a bad crowd, right? All right. Good stuff. Thank you, guys. To be dismissed. Looks like coffee and donuts are ready to go.